There comes a point where love is no longer about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go with dignity. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally realized they were never going to meet you at the depth you showed up with. This isn't about revenge. It's not about punishing them. It's about understanding the brutal truth. Some people only value peace when it's gone, and some only feel the weight of your presence when it's replaced by silence. You gave them access to the safest version of yourself, patient, forgiving, present, and they mistook it for permanence. They thought no matter how many times they ran, you'd always be waiting on the other side of their chaos. But eventually, even the strongest soul gets tired of bleeding for someone who can't stop wounding themselves. And when that day comes, you don't scream, you don't explain, you don't try to prove your worth one last time. You simply leave, quietly, cleanly, fully. Because there's a power in disappearing that words could never carry. A power in walking away not with hate, but with calm conviction. And that's what this is about. Not the heartbreak itself, but the transformation that happens after it. This is for the one who stayed too long, gave too much, and finally decided to stop carrying what wasn't theirs. You didn't fail. You outgrew the fantasy. And now, your silence is going to teach them what your presence never could. They couldn't stay, not because you weren't enough, but because staying required them to face parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Love was never the problem. Safety was. Real closeness stripped away the roles they were used to playing, the performer, the rebel, the victim, and left them with nothing but their raw self, exposed and unguarded. That terrified them. You didn't demand perfection, you offered depth. You didn't try to fix them, you gave them space to be real. But the very thing that made you safe also made you dangerous, because you saw them clearly. And when someone isn't ready to be seen, your presence becomes a mirror they can't look into without flinching. They mistook vulnerability for weakness, structure for control, and calm for indifference. So they pulled away, not because they wanted to lose you, but because losing themselves felt even scarier. They were wired to equate intimacy with risk. Their nervous system had learned long ago that closeness meant pain and distance meant survival. That's why they could give you fragments of honesty, then vanish. That's why they'd reach out when you detached, then sabotage the moment connection became too real. It was never about you being too much. It was about them being too unhealed to receive what you were offering. And if you don't understand that, you'll keep internalizing their flinch as rejection, when in truth it was fear. You were a test they couldn't pass yet, a door they weren't ready to walk through. And every time they tried, their past pulled them back. That's why they could never stay, not because the love wasn't there, but because their capacity to hold it wasn't built yet. You didn't scare them because you were cruel. You scared them because you were clear. You saw past the masks, the performances, the moods, the deflections. And for someone who spent their entire life learning to survive by staying hidden, that kind of presence isn't comforting, it's threatening. You weren't just a partner, you became a mirror. And the more they looked into you, the less they could maintain the fantasy that they were in control of themselves. You brought calm, structure, and truth into a world they had trained to be reactive, chaotic, and guarded. That kind of light forces a choice. Either step into it and evolve, or retreat into the shadows and blame the brightness. Most people retreat, because the truth is, many don't want real connection. They want control dressed up as closeness. They want someone to orbit their pain, not someone who challenges them to rise above it. You showed them a version of love that required accountability, softness, and showing up without games. But that meant confronting their guilt, their shame, their unhealed trauma. And when people haven't done the inner work, they don't see that as healing. They see that as threat. So they run, or sabotage, or convince themselves that you're the problem because that's easier than looking at what they project. You didn't fail them, you reflected them. And the sad truth is, some people don't want to be seen until they're bleeding. By then, they're usually alone. So when you ask yourself why they couldn't love you the way you loved them, remember this: it wasn't a matter of love, it was a matter of self-confrontation. and they weren't ready to face what you revealed. Not yet. The cycle was never built on love. It was built on survival, control, and emotional dysregulation masked as passion. They didn't pull you in because they were ready to love you. They pulled you in because they needed relief from their own emotional storm. And the moment you gave them calm, structure, and validation, it became too real. So they pushed away, not because you did something wrong, but because closeness made them feel vulnerable, and vulnerability threatened the emotional armor they've worn their entire life. This is the push-pull dynamic. Pull you in to feel safe, push you away to feel powerful. Draw you close to test your love, then manufacture distance to see if you'll still chase. It's a nervous system game, an unconscious tug-of-war between wanting to be loved and fearing what love demands. And if you're not aware of the pattern, you'll keep mistaking the pull for progress and the push for punishment. You'll try harder when they flinch, offer softness when they go cold, reach out when they disappear. And every time you do, you reinforce their control over the emotional temperature of the connection. That's how the bond deepens, not through genuine growth, but through psychological confusion. They train you to accept inconsistency as proof of depth, to measure love by how much pain you're willing to tolerate. And the worst part is, you start believing that if you just say the right thing, wait a little longer, or love them a little harder, they'll finally stop pushing. But they won't, because the push is the only thing that makes them feel safe. They crave love, but only on their terms. They want connection, but not at the cost of control. And the moment you start seeing the game for what it is, not a reflection of your worth, but their emotional fear, you begin to understand why silence is your only way out. Because as long as you keep playing, they'll keep pulling and pushing. But when you stop responding, the game ends, and the collapse begins. Silence is not the absence of care. It's the loudest boundary you'll ever set. It says, I've given you every chance to meet me in truth, and now I'm done handing you more of me than you're ready to hold. For someone who thrives on emotional chaos, silence is terrifying, not because it hurts them directly, but because it removes their ability to control the rhythm of your connection. They were used to the dynamic where you'd reach back when they withdrew, explain yourself when they shut down, soothe their guilt when they vanished. They depended on your reactions to feel powerful again. But when the silence comes, not the passive-aggressive kind, but the clean kind, the "you're no longer entitled to my access" kind, they're left with nothing but their own echo. No comfort, no reassurance, no counterbalance to their self-sabotage. And that's when their nervous system starts to spin, because the story they tell themselves, the one where they're always in control, begins to crack. They start checking for signs, watching if you'll reach out, wondering if your calm means indifference, or if it's the calm before you disappear for good. That's the internal war silence triggers, a confrontation with their own behavior, stripped of distraction. And while they may pretend not to notice, don't be fooled. The silence sinks in slowly. It lingers in the space where your presence used to regulate them. It haunts them not immediately, but in quiet moments, late at night, between dopamine hits, when the noise dies down and the emptiness they kept running from shows up again. They'll replay everything, trying to decide if you're punishing them or if you're actually gone this time. But the truth is, you're not punishing them. You're preserving yourself. Silence is not cruelty, it's clarity. And for someone who weaponized confusion to maintain control, clarity is the one thing they never expected you to have the strength to deliver. But now that you have, they're left with the weight of their own choices and no voice left to blame but their own.
At some point, you realize the difference between love and self-sacrifice, and that moment changes everything. You wake up one day and feel the quiet exhaustion of constantly trying to be the one who steadies the storm, softens the silence, interprets the mixed signals, and forgives what keeps breaking you. And that's when it hits you, not like rage, but like stillness. You don't want to save them anymore. Not because you stopped loving them, but because you finally started loving yourself enough to stop bleeding for someone who keeps sharpening their edges against you. You see, when you love someone in their brokenness, it's easy to think your patience will be the thing that finally makes them whole. But the truth is, you can't heal someone who benefits from staying wounded. You can't carry both your emotions and their avoidance. You can't keep handing them clarity in hopes they'll finally stop operating from confusion. They know you care. They always did. But they used your empathy like a cushion, something soft to collapse into whenever the consequences of their own patterns became too heavy. You became the emotional paramedic, always rushing in with reassurance after they wrecked another opportunity for closeness. But what you didn't see is that every time you saved them, they became less accountable. Every time you explained yourself, they became more entitled to your grace. And every time you tried to keep the connection alive, they learned they could disappear and still be welcomed back without having to grow. But that ends the moment you stop trying to be the savior. The moment you let the silence speak louder than your compassion. Because true compassion doesn't mean setting yourself on fire to keep someone warm. It means knowing when to step back and let them feel the cold. That's not cruelty, that's evolution. That's the day you stop proving your worth to someone who only sees it clearly when you're walking away. And from that moment forward, you're not their comfort anymore, you're their consequence. There comes a moment where you stop trying to shield them from themselves, and instead, you step out of the way. Not with malice, not with revenge, but with the quiet, grounded conviction that some people will never wake up until they feel the cold edge of your absence. You gave them enough chances to grow. You gave them clarity, softness, forgiveness, and still they chose confusion, distance, and control. And now they need to live inside the world they've created. A world where your voice no longer rescues them from their guilt. A world where your patience doesn't stretch wide enough to catch their fall. A world where the damage they once blamed on others starts echoing back as accountability. This is the part most people never see, the consequence. Because you're no longer there to soothe the spiral, to answer the late-night reach-outs, to hold the space while they avoid the work. Your silence becomes a reflection of everything they refuse to face. And it doesn't always hit right away. At first, they tell themselves you'll be back. They convince themselves you're just being dramatic or testing them. But time has a way of clearing delusion, and the longer you stay gone, the louder reality gets. They start to realize that this time you're not punishing them, you're just no longer available for the same cycle. And that silence becomes the most honest response you've ever given. Because now there's nothing left to interpret, no mixed signals, no safety net, just the raw, undeniable truth. They had access to something rare, and they let it slip through their hands. And for someone who's built their identity on running before they get left, there is no pain more humbling than being left by someone who never wanted to leave, but finally had to. You're not proving a point. You're not playing a role. You're just standing in your worth. And whether they realize it now or 10 months from now, the weight of your absence will be heavier than anything your presence ever felt like. Because now they know if they want that light back, they don't just have to reach out, they have to rise. They may look calm, they may post stories, laugh with friends, and even act indifferent. But the war doesn't begin in their actions, it begins in their nervous system. The moment your emotional regulation disappears. You were their anchor, even when they didn't admit it. You were the calm beneath the chaos, the mirror that reflected both their potential and their patterns. And when you go silent, not to manipulate, but to preserve yourself, it destabilizes the foundation they were leaning on without realizing. Suddenly, the validation doesn't arrive on cue. The guilt they used to avoid gets louder. The control they thought they had starts to crack. This isn't always a meltdown. It's quieter, more internal, more prolonged. First comes the denial. They'll be back. Then the testing. Story posts, indirect signals, subtle digital nudges. Then the confusion. Why are they really gone? And finally, the fear. Not fear of losing someone they didn't love, but fear of facing the truth that love was never the issue. Their own capacity to hold it was. The silence begins to press on the edges of their identity. Their strong one persona starts to feel hollow. Their "I don't need anyone" story doesn't land the same when there's no longer someone to prove it to. And even if they distract themselves, keep busy, or find temporary replacements, it doesn't quiet the ache that only your presence once soothed. Because you weren't just a person, they used you as an emotional filter, a place to project, collapse, test, and recover. And now that filter's gone. The nervous system doesn't adapt overnight. It keeps searching for the old rhythm, your voice, your softness, your steady frame. But you're not there. And what's left? A mirror they now have to face alone. The questions begin. The memories surface. The guilt they used to hand you now sits directly in their own hands. And for someone who's built their survival around avoiding that exact feeling, that's where the real unraveling begins. Not with your words, but with your silence. Not with confrontation, but with the void. You became the calm they can't replicate. And now, without your energy to regulate theirs, the storm they've been outrunning catches up. They always come back, but rarely for the reason you've been holding out for. Not because they've finally evolved, not because they've suddenly grasped the full depth of your value. No, the first return is almost always a test. A nervous reach back toward the place that once held them so softly they forgot it was a choice, not an obligation. They come back to see if you'll still soothe them, if your silence was real or just a temporary pause in their pattern. And when they do, it rarely looks dramatic. It's often subtle, a meme, a casual check-in, an "I miss you" that carries more curiosity than remorse. They don't say, "I'm ready to grow." They say, "Are you still there?" Because what they're really asking is, do I still have access to your emotional safety without having to earn it? And if you respond with too much softness, too quickly, too freely, you reset the cycle. You reinforce their belief that they can keep orbiting your light without ever building their own. That's why the first return isn't a reunion. It's a mirror. One last chance to see if you'll choose yourself this time. Will you fall back into the role of rescuer, fixer, emotional anchor? Or will you hold your ground and let them rise to meet you where you've already arrived? Because here's the truth. People don't return when they're healed. They return when the silence becomes heavier than their pride. And in that moment, they're not reaching for love, they're reaching for relief. Relief from guilt, uncertainty, emotional withdrawal. And you used to be the relief. Now you have to be the boundary. Not to punish them, but to protect the version of you that finally realized your peace matters more than their unfinished journey. So when they come back, and they will, don't just listen to their words. Watch their growth. Feel their energy. Sense whether they're still looking for a place to collapse or if they finally learned how to stand. Because this time, the door they knocked on doesn't swing open for free.
Healing is not about clinging to what was or desperately hoping for what could be. It's not about replaying every moment, dissecting every word, or questioning your own worth in the mirror of someone else's pain. Real healing starts the moment you stop defining yourself through their absence or presence. It begins when you reclaim your narrative, your power, your peace, independent of their chaos or approval. You learn that your value isn't tied to being needed or chosen, it's rooted in simply being. When you shift your focus inward, the noise of past hurt loses its grip. The urge to explain yourself, to justify your patience, to soften your boundaries, all these begin to fade. Because you finally understand that love isn't a transaction or a battle, it's a state of being that starts with yourself. You also realize that walking away isn't an act of weakness, it's an act of courage. Courage to face your own loneliness, your own scars, without blaming others for them. Courage to embrace the uncertainty of not knowing if they'll ever be ready. Courage to stay grounded in your truth when the world tries to pull you back into the cycle of chaos. And when you arrive there, at your center, you become unshakable. You're not cold or bitter, you're calm, clear, and whole. That's the real victory. Not reclaiming what was lost, but reclaiming who you are beyond it. So let the silence break them while you build the life that never needed their validation. Because in the end, the only love that truly matters is the love you give yourself. The final truth you must carry is this: your story isn't defined by who left first, who chased harder, or who broke down last. It's defined by how you rise after the fall. The wounds you've carried, the silence you've endured, they are the forge that shapes your resilience. Moving forward means stepping into a future where your worth isn't up for negotiation. It means recognizing that the energy you once gave to trying to control or fix another's journey is better spent cultivating your own growth, joy, and peace. It means setting boundaries so firm that they're felt before words are spoken, and holding a presence so steady it doesn't need validation from anyone else. Yes, the cycle may tempt you to look back, to question, to soften the lines, but every step forward is a victory against the past that tried to claim you. And remember, freedom isn't just about walking away, it's about never needing to return. You've outgrown the patterns that once held you hostage, and the silence you held, it wasn't emptiness, it was power. Power to rewrite your narrative, to choose yourself unapologetically, and to move through life with a calm that no one can shake. So let the silence break them while you build a legacy rooted in strength, clarity, and self-respect. Because that is the truest form of victory, the kind that lasts. Once the dust settles and the silence lingers, a new chapter begins, one not about waiting for their return, but about reclaiming your identity outside the shadows of the past. This is where you rebuild, not from what was broken, but from what was hidden beneath the surface: strength, clarity, and an unwavering sense of self that no external validation can shake. The cycle you endured wasn't just about two people. It was a war between your old self and the person you're becoming. And this transformation isn't comfortable. It demands confronting your fears, acknowledging your wounds, and stepping into the unknown without guarantees. But within that discomfort lies freedom. Freedom from patterns of codependency, from the urge to fix or explain, and from the emotional debt that kept you tethered. It's where love transforms from a desperate need to a quiet power, a force you cultivate within yourself before offering it to others. You learn to love without attachment, to give without expectation, and to hold space for others without losing your own ground. This redefinition creates a new foundation for future connections, healthier, stronger, and more aligned with your truth. And the best part? You no longer chase love. Love chases you. Because when you are whole, centered, and free, you become a force of nature, a presence that commands respect, draws in authenticity, and no longer tolerates anything less than genuine. This is your evolution, your victory over the past, and the beginning of a life lived on your terms. True mastery isn't about control over others, it's control over yourself. It's the quiet power of knowing your worth without needing external validation. After the chaos, the silence, and the emotional warfare, you arrive at a place where your peace is non-negotiable. You no longer react to their actions, the fluctuations of connection, or the unpredictable tides of their return. Instead, you respond with calm certainty, grounded in the knowledge that your life, your energy, and your love are yours to give, but never at the expense of your soul. This mastery means you've learned to hold boundaries not as walls, but as sacred spaces that protect your growth. It means embracing solitude without loneliness, strength without hardness, and love without attachment. You become a warrior of your own heart, a guardian of your emotional ecosystem. The past no longer haunts you because you have reclaimed the narrative, healed the wounds, and dismantled the stories that once kept you stuck. When they come back, or when new connections arise, you engage not from need, but from choice. You know that true connection is a meeting of whole beings, not two halves desperate to complete each other. And that freedom, hard-won and fiercely guarded, is the most powerful form of love there is. Because it's not dependent on anyone else's readiness, it's rooted in your own strength. This is where your journey ends and begins simultaneously, free, whole, and unbreakable. The path from heartbreak to healing is never linear. It's a battlefield marked by setbacks, revelations, and fierce self-discovery. But through every trial, you learn the essence of what it means to be a warrior of the heart. You realize that vulnerability is not weakness, but the gateway to true strength. You understand that your scars tell a story, not of defeat, but of survival and growth. In this final phase, you embrace the totality of your experience, the pain, the love, the loss, and the lessons. You no longer see yourself as a victim of their choices, but as the architect of your own destiny. This shift allows you to rewrite your narrative from reactive to proactive, from being at the mercy of others to commanding your own emotional kingdom. You cultivate resilience not by shutting down, but by opening wider with fierce protection. You honor your boundaries as sacred, knowing they guard the space where your true self thrives. This is the moment where self-respect becomes your compass, guiding you through future storms with grace and unwavering clarity. The echoes of the past still linger, but they serve as reminders of how far you've come, not chains that hold you back. You step forward with a calm confidence that no one can shake, because it is born from deep, unyielding self-awareness. The bad gal mask, the chaos, the silence, they're all chapters in your story, not the final word. You've transformed the pain into power, the wounds into wisdom, and the silence into your strongest voice. And that voice will carry you into a future where you no longer chase shadows, but stand firmly in your own light, whole, unbreakable, and free. You've walked through the fire of a painful cycle, stared down the ghosts of emotional chaos, and stood firm in the silence that finally sets you free. This journey isn't easy. It's messy, raw, and sometimes lonely. But within that difficulty lies the greatest truth. Freedom is born from the courage to let go, not just of others, but of the versions of yourself that no longer serve your growth.
Letting go is not a sign of failure or weakness. It's an act of radical self-respect, a declaration that your peace matters more than anyone else's need for control or avoidance. You've learned that love is not a bargaining chip, a weapon, or a safety net. It's a state of being that starts within. And when you claim that love for yourself, you become unshakable. The silence you hold is not emptiness, it's power. It's the space where healing begins, where growth takes root,
and where your future is forged. Remember this, your worth was never dependent on their presence, their approval, or their return. It has always been and will always be rooted in who you are at your core. So walk forward with calm strength, steady purpose, and unyielding self-trust. Let the silence break them, while you build a life so full of light and clarity that no darkness can touch it. This is your story. Own it, live it, thrive in it.